Hi, my name is Stephen Ruggles, and I want to welcome you all to Minneapolis. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Ailshire, our keynote speaker for the 2023 Data Intensive Research Conference. As the director of IPUMS, I'm excited to see the growth of research networks that emphasize the value and power of freely available population representative data for novel research applications. And the presentations and both at the pre-conference workshop and the conference program have been remarkable, and they highlight the value of this wide range of data sources for contextualizing health and well-being with consideration of place. So one couldn't imagine a more appropriate keynote speaker for a conference focused on place and well-being than through the life course than Dr. Ailshire. She completed her PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan in 2009. After completing her PhD, she served as a NIA postdoc at the University of Southern California's Andrus Gerontology Center. In 2012, she received a prestigious K99 award from NIA, and she joined the USC Gerontology faculty in 2014. Since 2019, she has served as the director of USC's Gerontology PhD program. Dr. Ailshire's work focuses on the intersection of neighborhoods, family, and health across the life course, all topics that are integral to the conversations we're having as part of this conference. She consistently showcases the power of population representative data for aging research, especially with the health and retirement study. She's played a key role in the development of the HRS Contextual Data Resource Series, which links neighborhood characteristics to HRS respondents. And of course, she has also used IPUMS data. Her work shows a commitment to the goals that are central to the research networks that are sponsoring this conference: building community, lowering barriers to using complex data, and increasing diversity through engagement with scholars that are systematically excluded from academia. Dr. Ailshire today will be talking about environmental determinants, and unraveling the influence of environments on health and aging, persistent challenges, and new opportunities. So welcome, Dr. Ailshire.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I think this is an excellent conference series, and this year's topic is an excellent topic, though I may be a bit biased. So you can see from the title that I'm going to be talking a lot about this sense of the persistent challenges that are sometimes frustrating to us, but also the excitement around all of the new opportunities in health and place research. But before starting with that, I just want to remind ourselves why the work that we do is so important, why the work that all of you are doing is so essential. In the about 20 years that I've been working in this area, I've seen a pretty seismic shift in the perceptions from many different stakeholders on what the key drivers of both individual and population health are. So there was this biomedical perception that predominated for a long time, the idea that it's really about individuals, changing behaviors, doing things at the individual level. But actually, there is now broad acknowledgement that lives are experienced in this broader context. I think we had a presentation today that really demonstrated this point beautifully, which is the idea that when people go into hospitals, they have a major health event, they go home, sometimes they need home health care. But the context in which they get that care could be quite variable. And we saw from the presentation today that there's a lot of social, racial, and ethnic inequality in that care. But something as simple as wound care, for instance, if you can't get scheduling with your home healthcare provider, the people show up unprepared, if there are language barriers and someone doesn't get proper wound care, they could very well end up with an infection that sends them back to the hospital to encounter an even worse health outcome. And there are countless other examples I could give. But what I think is important is to remind ourselves what we're doing is really essential. And then the other thing I've noticed is that there was, and still is, a lot of talk about these kind of endowments, like genetic endowments and other kinds of endowments. But what the research is really consistently showing is that regardless of what the endowments are that people are looking at, really environments are determining how much those endowments actually impact health. So I would consider that kind of like the basic science, and we're all basic science researchers, but I saw that a few people in this crowd are also really interested in policy and practical implications. And I think we also need to remember that our basic science research is really important for policies and programs. So place-based initiatives have been shown time and again to be really effective health policy. On the other hand, a lot of the interventions based on individual level behavioral changes have shown pretty consistently to fail. And this is partly because when we change environments, we can impact a lot of different people and a lot of outcomes all at once, and you don't even have to go the route of individual behavioral change. So something like greening communities, putting shade at bus stops, these are actually not major changes that we can make in the environment, but they do have large impacts on individuals and populations. So as I said, I'm going to focus on challenges and opportunities, and I think of these in kind of three buckets: theory, data, and methods. So in terms of theory, we do have a nice set of theories to guide our work, but the world is changing very rapidly and our research area is changing extremely rapidly. And so I think we're going to have to be focusing a little bit more on developing additional theories to help us, for instance, understand some of these really complex interactions. When I say that, I mean both the complex interactions between environment and biology, and also the complex interactions between different environmental conditions. So I think a lot of us are going to have to be thinking about using a total environment framework, which is what some folks are talking about, something that the Environmental Protection Agency became very interested in when they realized that just focusing on chemical environmental exposures was not enough. They also want to be thinking about social environments and built environments, and we too are going to be having to incorporate that kind of a framework in our work. As you've heard also as well today, that the life course is very important in this, and we're thinking about what is this life course of exposures. Some of you may have heard this term exposome. If you haven't, you will at some point, because the exposome is really kind of trying to encompass the life course of exposures, and that is going to be the sort of new universe that we're going to have to understand. And then we have a lot more data and focus, fortunately, on the diversity of places and populations. And so we may have to reevaluate some of our theoretical perspectives there as well. One of the most pernicious challenges in this field, for those of us who have been working in health and place research for a while, has been data. We just have not had the data that we want. Suddenly we have access to so much data, and we've seen already such a multitude of data today. Things I never even knew about that I'm very interested in looking into. So it's simultaneously been a huge challenge, but I think this is also one of our best new opportunities, because I see new data sets coming out basically every month that suddenly equip us to answer questions we've had for a long time, but we're just frustrated because we didn't have the data to answer them. So, and the linkage potentials I think are great. IPUMS does really fantastic work with data linkages, and it sets a phenomenal example of how to do this in a way that benefits the research community. So we're getting data at greater spatial and temporal resolution. We're getting data across the life course. We're very excited about this. And then finally, we're going to have to develop a lot more methods to deal with all of this data, obviously. So I see us really needing to move from more single variable approaches to looking at the multidimensionality of environmental exposures, and also some of the synergistic interactions between different environmental exposures. We're going to have to be able to manage high dimensional data, because we now live in a big data, high dimensional data world. And then I think another challenge for us is going to be how we're going to use this data to sequence the life course. And so these are the challenges. I don't have any answers for you on this today, but I think that these are also the new opportunities that a lot of us are really excited about. And I have no doubt that some folks in this room will be innovating on it. So throughout the talk, I'm going to give you some stylized examples. I had to kind of limit things, I only have a certain amount of time today, where I'm going to bring up these topics of theory, data, and methods. But first, I just want to make one point about data. So we've had a really massive and rapid expansion in the availability of data. This is a picture of the IPUMS server room. I'm just kidding. I don't know what the IPUMS server room looks like. They probably have multiple server rooms given all the data they've got. But just to give you an example and a quick plug, I co-run a network that's funded by the NIA with some colleagues that's focused a lot on the kind of geographic determinants and variability and health over the life course and health disparities. And we're in this abundance of data. It's a problem. It's a good problem to have, but the problem is trying to locate the data that you need. So my team and I built this tool, and it's available on our website. And basically, you can go to the website and make some selections, either if you're interested in macro context or local context. We also have some tools and infographics. And you can just kind of scroll through. I'm trying to see if this video is going to work for me. Let's see what happens. So if you just kind of scroll down, as I did here, I'm scrolling down to the local context. And it has some data catalogs, and I don't know if it's going to make it all the way down. Thanks for the assist. So I just scroll down here to local context, and then I've chosen a geographic level here. I choose tracks. I promise I did this totally randomly. I then selected the topic was land use, and it goes to a clickable link. And then it just so happened that that took us to an IPUMS website. I didn't do this on purpose. And by the way, back to my comment about new data coming out all the time, I just noticed, so the Sabin school areas information is in here, and that is a huge tool for people who are interested in boundaries, like school boundaries. And I know people who have spent their entire graduate careers sitting in like microdata dungeons trying to do this, and now IPUMS just has it available for you. Impressive. Some other examples of these data repositories are the Neighborhood Data Archive, which is housed at the University of Michigan at ICPSR, and this is run by Philippa Clark and her really great team there. They have phenomenal data. They update it like every month. They seem to be putting a really great data set on there. And then, of course, I created a contextual data resource for the health and retirement study, and we're now doing it for the Understanding America study. And actually, we have been working now with MICTA, which is the virtual enclave at Michigan. So you can also use these data with the PSID and the NHATs. So these are all the kind of data developments. I think the next developments we're going to be seeing that I'm most excited about are the folks that are working on digitizing historical maps and trying to get us more historical data. And some of us have become friends with computer scientists who are helping us use machine learning to try to take a massive amount of satellite and street data and create measures from that as well. Okay, so we have all of these data, but now how do we think about this idea of the total environment and life course exposures? There are any number of conceptual diagrams that can help us think about this. I've created a super simple one, which is basically how I think about it. So I have these kind of bins. We have characteristics of the physical and built environment, the social environment, we call the chemical environment, and then amenities or resources. And then this sort of wraps around the individual. And in the middle there, I'm showing sort of my conception of time or life course exposures, because I think we have to remember that the way that time works is that people can have a duration of exposure, which may be important, but sometimes exposures also matter more at certain points in the life course. So this is this kind of added layer of complexity that we have to think about as we try to incorporate more life course into our research. I'm not going to be showing you a lot of work on life course because frankly, we haven't had a lot of data on life course, but we're getting a lot of data. And I think this is going to be the future of my work as well as others who work in health and place. So I'm just going to go through some examples to kind of highlight some of the issues that I see in health and place research. So when I started working on the topic about 20 years ago, the vast majority of the kind of neighborhood health effects studies were done using census data because that's what was broadly available. Some of us were fortunate enough to work on single city studies, like I worked in the city of Chicago, which at that point had really excellent GIS resources for researchers. But at kind of a national level, there wasn't a lot available. So there's been a huge body of literature that's linked neighborhood socioeconomic status measured with census characteristics at typically the tract level to a variety of health outcomes for children all the way through the life course to older adults. But we really think that something like neighborhood poverty is operating through some other kind of social aspects. And for me, it was a little frustrating because I could see, yes, impoverished environments matter, but we really want to drill down and understand what is it about living in poverty that can be so detrimental for health and well-being. So I work a lot with measures of neighborhood disorder and cohesion, which can be defined in various ways, but disorder is usually about some kind of aspects of decay or illicit or illegal activity that's going on in your environment. And cohesion is about feelings of reciprocity and exchange and a sense of trust and belonging with your neighborhoods. So I worked on a project that I just handed over to a postdoc, because postdocs have been helping faculty since the beginning of time. And so this postdoc's been helping me finish up this project, which was a longstanding question that I had about the role of neighborhood poverty in determining hopelessness. So we know that there's a big link between hopelessness and poverty. It's one of the really pernicious things about living in poverty. But I wanted to try to understand how much of this association, and so here is just showing a total effect of 0.78, is actually mediated through neighborhood disorder. So my hypothesis is that the problem with neighborhood poverty, as measured with census variables, is that it has an impact on the social environment and that it's really neighborhood disorder that's probably promoting these feelings of hopelessness. So we modeled that as well. And then what we found was that the indirect effect was about 80% of the total effect. So I think this is a good example of trying to use the census, the information we have from the census, which is important, but try to add in some of these other environmental characteristics so that we can understand what is it, things that might be a little more mutable, something we can intervene on. What is it about impoverished neighborhood environments that are really leading to poor health outcomes? So the other frustration I've had in my career in this world is that we often measure a neighborhood or an environmental condition, and it's a little concurrent with a health outcome like a disease. But disease processes happen over years. And so we always have this kind of timing issue. And that's been a bit frustrating for me as well. But fortunately, in addition to having many more sources of information on environmental exposures, we also have a lot more information on individual biology. So I've started working with these new measures of epigenetic clocks. These are summaries of DNA methylation. You don't have to have any kind of an understanding of biology. I'm just going to tell you that what it's basically telling us is how are the cells doing in an individual. And so the way these measures are constructed is they take all this DNA methylation information and they create biological age, and then they take the residual of that against the chronological age. And so if people have a positive residual, it means they're aging faster than the kind of average person. And if they have a negative residual, it means that they have decelerated aging. And so we're looking at this with neighborhood disorder. We're measuring both observed and perceived. This is another comment I've gotten many times over the years. Is it really observed or perceived? In this case, we're not actually seeing a big difference. It looks like it's different, but it's because the observed measure is dichotomized. So it's not actually a much bigger effect because the perceived disorder is on a scale ranging from 1 to 7. But basically, we look at two different clocks, which are just two different approaches to measuring this accelerated aging. And we find in either case, and whether we're looking at perceived or observed disorder, that individuals from the health and retirement study who live in more disordered neighborhoods tend to have, on average, more accelerated aging. This, I think, is also really a good approach because we have new data sources that have a lot of information, but they're younger people, so they're not getting into the ages yet where they're going to experience a lot of these age-related diseases. So having some of these pre-disease status biological indicators of aging is going to be helpful for us to understand the processes linking environments to health. We did the same exercise, but instead of neighborhood disorder, we looked at neighborhood cohesion. And while disorder is associated with accelerated aging, cohesion is associated with decelerated aging. These disorder and cohesion findings are super consistent with a very large body of literature now that shows that disorder tends to be associated with adverse outcomes, and neighborhood cohesion not only tends to be associated with better outcomes, but can often serve as a buffer against other stressors in the environment or the individual's lives. So I use neighborhood disorder a lot, but I do think we need to update our theories a bit. So if I show you this picture, I think we can all agree this is probably disorder. And I'm focusing particularly on the graffiti. But if I show you this picture of graffiti, I don't think anyone would think it's necessarily a sign of disorder. And so I'm fortunate to have colleagues who constantly question my work. No, but they provide really helpful feedback on like, that if graffiti is part of a disorder measure in some neighborhoods, graffiti is not seen as a bad thing necessarily, then what are you really measuring? And yeah, like part of the problem is some of our urban theory comes from 1990s Chicago, which is not necessarily a relevant context for other places. And also the meaning of things can change over time. So I want to make sure that we're attuned to the fact that what we think about social environments comes from a time and a place that was reflective of a very specific context, but we may need to be thinking about updating our theories. So I'm going to move on to the chemical environment. So I have a degree in sociology with training in demography, and I was a little surprised to find myself in a multidisciplinary group studying the effect of air pollution on the brain. So I was working with biologists and chemists, and I was the only sociologist, the only demographer, the only person studying older adults. But I found this multidisciplinary effort and perspective to be very useful in my work. And this was the first paper that we published from this work, showing differences in cognitive functioning among these older adults in the health and retirement study across different levels of concentrations of PM 2.5. So the first marker on here shows the higher cognitive functioning scores for people who lived in the lowest quartile of PM 2.5 concentrations. But as we went up in quartiles, around the third and fourth quartile, we see the lower scores on cognitive functioning. And the third and fourth quartiles are not different from each other, but they're both higher than 12 micrograms per cubic meter, which the EPA has set as the threshold above which we are very concerned about population health. So this is like a half a point difference on the scale. I was very interested in what the magnitude of this coefficient actually meant, but we looked in the literature and also in our own data, and it's equivalent to like 3 to 5 years of aging, which is not, it's non-trivial. So this is something that we've continued to look into. But as a sociologist, I'm very interested in social inequality. And as a demographer, I know there's a lot of population heterogeneity. So I was working on this topic in the group, and I was thinking about the fact that there's differences in susceptibility to a lot of environmental exposures. And I just didn't think that probably everyone would have this impact on their cognitive health based on the ambient air pollution levels. Right around that time, I was reading a lot on the topic because it was new for me. And I came across this really excellent paper by Gil G. and Devon Payne Sturgis. They were trying to come up with a model to really understand this exposure disease relationship with respect to stress, and they're working in environmental disparities. It's a great paper. You should check it out if you're interested, not even just in air pollution, but if you're just thinking about other kinds of exposures as well. But I was really interested in this idea of an air pollution exposure and community stress. And the fact that that kind of exposure to a community stressor might actually change an individual's ability to respond to another environmental stressor, in this case, air pollution, so that the internal dose, the biologically effective dose, might actually be impacted by other things that are going on. For me, that made a lot of sense because I was studying cognition. The brain is considered the target organ for stress. It's also where I was studying my outcome. So my main questions were, if we know from a lot of literature that chronic stress is associated with neuronal damage and other kinds of outcomes like decreased performance on cognitive tasks, then perhaps neighborhood stressors could exacerbate the impact of air pollution on these older adults. So I came up with my own little model. I'd already looked at the association between environmental hazards and a health outcome, but I was interested in this role of social environmental stressors, which I know will generate some kind of psychological stress, probably change biological susceptibility, whether it's through compromise in immune functioning, increase in inflammation levels. Even one of the mechanisms could be a weakened blood-brain barrier, little tongue twister. And so this dotted arrow is what I was really trying to understand in this work. So we actually published this work in a different data set, the American Changing Life Study. It was a data set I made do with at the time because it's what I had, but it didn't have a large representation of Black or Hispanic populations. It didn't allow me to look over time. So we've now replicated this work in HRS. Replicating a study and getting the same findings is such a good feeling. But so we basically replicated this finding, and it's the same finding that as concentrations of PM 2.5 increase, scores on this cognitive function test decrease. But we looked at this for this interaction between neighborhood disorder, which is what we use as a community stressor, and air pollution. And you can see that for individuals who live in neighborhoods with low levels of disorder, the line's actually flat. There's really no relationship between air pollution and cognitive functioning. It's really capturing a relationship for the people who live in these more stressful neighborhoods. So at the time, I think when we published the other paper, there had been one other paper looking at interactions with community stressors and air pollution and older adult cognitive functioning outcomes. Some of the literature, like in the MESA study, has looked at cardiovascular outcomes, and the findings have been a bit mixed. But I will say in the children's literature, there's very strong evidence of an interaction between child's experience of stress, some kind of environmental pollutant, and how well they do on tests of their thinking and concentration, which is kind of their equivalent of cognitive functioning tests. So this is an example of really trying to understand the synergistic effects. It was also an example of a social scientist making her way through a physical environmental world and bringing it right back to social sciences and trying to make the point that these social variables are just as important as the physical variables. And we can't really understand the impact of air pollution on human health without really investigating some of these social aspects of people's lives. One of my great frustrations working in this area, however, is that I often get asked by reviewers of my grants and papers about the life course of exposure. In my case, it's impossible. The US government didn't start monitoring for PM 2.5 until around the year 2000. People have tried to do these kind of backwards interpolations, but modeled estimates are never quite as satisfying as measurements. So I was really excited when this work was published, and this comes from a group here at Minnesota. So this is the 1940s, it's the results of the linkage of the 1940 census with the health and retirement study. And lead is something that we have been, we have an ability to understand early in people's life course. And so this is a postdoc that worked at USC that worked with Rob Warren and some other folks, modeling the association between exposure to leaded pipes in US cities and cognitive functioning scores. And so the red line shows that people who were exposed to this higher lead concentration as they measured it had lower cognitive functioning scores. And this is consistent with other work that has found that blood lead levels in childhood are associated with cognitive functioning, say like at age 38, but this is the first study that's showing us what's going on in a much older cohort of older adults. So I'm very excited about the 1950s linkage that I think is going to be happening pretty soon, and some of the other work that people are doing to help us get the historical data so that we at least have some idea of what these people's exposures were early in life, because we pick older adults up at baseline in an aging survey like the health and retirement study, but they lived an entire life prior to that. And so hopefully with more data on residential histories and some of the historical data that is becoming available, we'll finally get more of a sense of people's lives. So the last environmental topic I'm going to cover is the amenities and resource environment, but I'm actually not going to spend very much time on it because as I was putting my slides together, I realized I would quickly be running out of time. So I just picked kind of like my favorite paper of the moment around amenities. And this is written by Jessica Finley and some of her colleagues. I didn't do any of this on purpose, I promise. They're just my favorite greatest hit papers. But Jessica, I believe, graduated from the geography department here at Minnesota, and I'm pretty sure Mike started as a faculty here last year. And they worked with Philippa Clark, who was one of my mentors at Michigan. But I really like what they were doing here with this idea of cognability and the fact that they're trying to develop a theoretical framework for thinking about how environments could actually impact cognitive functioning in older adults and middle-aged to older adults. And that they used this massive amount of data that they now have on local businesses and some of the other built environment characteristics to see whether or not they could find a relationship between cognitive functioning scores and local amenities. And what they found were that as people live in environments that have more opportunity to access the arts, museums, recreation spaces, civic and social organizations, that cognitive functioning score increased. And then highways, which are like the death of all good land use mix, basically, it actually shows a negative association with cognitive functioning. So this is a space where, again, I think we have a tremendous amount of work to do. I'm sure Jessica's, working on many other projects related to this. But like one thing that she and her team will have to figure out at some point is how do you take all of these different amenities and kind of put them together and scale them in a way that we can look at everything all at once and try to understand not just what is it about museums and arts, but what is the total environment that is impacting cognitive functioning. I'm just going to spend a few minutes on some work from the built environment, including this paper. I worked on this paper with Philippa Clark, who's one of the nicest people in academia when I was a grad student. It remains one of my absolute most favorite papers, because what we were able to do in the paper was to show empirically support for a theory on the disablement process, which was that people can have underlying physiological impairments, but it's really the environment that determines whether or not we have a disability. So like I have a vision impairment, but I can wear glasses, so I'm not disabled by it. What we did was use data from the city of Chicago to look at the interaction between street conditions, which was sort of a proxy for sidewalk conditions for us because we didn't have data on that, and the association between severe lower body physical limitations and disability. I've never seen odds ratios this high. I think it's amazing. But what it's really telling you is basically, if you have a severe lower body impairment, you have a mobility disability. So in this case, the mobility disability question is, do you have difficulty walking around the block? What I find interesting, though, is that for those individuals who lived in places where the streets were in good conditions, that relationship was not as strong. So that having that lower body physical limitation did not necessarily mean that they said they had a mobility disability. So I think this is an excellent example of trying to use the data that we have to do empirical tests of theory. And then I also think this is really good support for the idea that, uneven sidewalks and construction can really be a hindrance to population health. And it's something that we could address to immediately decrease mobility disability in a community, for instance. This is from a review piece that reviewed all of the literature linking green space to health. I've heard from people like green space is not something that you can change, it's the physical environment, but actually we decide where to green. We plant trees, we can take trees out. This to me is a very intervenable point, and it's related to like every outcome that we're interested in, from sleep to mortality. There have been studies that have shown pretty robust associations, even taking into account potential selection, that people who move into greener neighborhoods have better outcomes, and that these outcomes are found throughout the life course, from children to older adults. Another aspect of the physical environment that's receiving a lot of attention, and you just saw really excellent presentation on this, is heat. So my group and I have taken the same data set, this GridMet data set, to try to understand change in heat over time and also change in population. From my perspective, there are these two trends that are now intersecting in a really unfortunate way. So older adults are very vulnerable to heat. There's some age-related physiological changes that make it harder for us to self-regulate, to thermal-regulate. And a lot of older adults live in places that are warming. So on the one hand, we looked at it's a heat index. So it's not just temperature, we're also taking into account humidity, which is really important. And on the other hand, we're looking at change in the population over time. And we started this project before that really bad heat wave that happened in the Pacific Northwest, but we had already shown that these were places that were getting warmer over time. We worry about this because at the intersection of heat and population aging, we're going to see a lot of public health issues that we're going to have to react to very quickly. And so this is another area of research that I think is going to probably be the next 10 years easily of our focus and efforts. And I'm going to come back to this topic in a subsequent slide. So I think the future of health and place research is in multidisciplinary teams. I think it's really helpful when you have a physical environment focused person working with someone who's more focused on social factors. I even think having biologists on the team can help, because it took me a while to really understand why heat is so problematic, and heat plus humidity is so problematic for older adults. It's similarly problematic for children. I think we have some really incredibly exciting opportunities in linking data across the life course, including from these historical sources, and I'm very interested to see how much that's going to propel health and place research. There are methods now for modeling multiple environmental exposures and trying to understand those synergies. Some of those methods include things like machine learning, and we're all going to have to learn about machine learning. Spoiler alert, it's just regression. And it suffers from the same problem all methods do, which is like real garbage in, garbage out. So it's important for us to make sure that to the extent we're going to be using these methods, the data that are going in are good, they're consistent with theory, and that the results we get out are interpretable. But this is something that people like us will need to do. So this field cannot move forward in any kind of meaningful, productive way without the involvement of health and place researchers. And then again, I just think it's important to remember how much our work on environmental exposures and the impacts on individuals inform our understanding of the health of the population and development of policies and programs. So I want to wrap up by just pointing out kind of 3 big topics that I think we're all going to be hearing a lot about moving forward. So I just talked to you about heat, and I showed you a little bit of the work that we were doing. I just want everyone to keep in mind that heat is a physical phenomenon. It's a climatic change, and it's, leading to things like wildfires. But the health impacts are going to be determined largely by social factors. So whether or not older adults are socially isolated is going to determine the impact of heat. Economic resources. So there are some jurisdictions now that are saying that utilities companies cannot shut off utilities that have overdue bills if they're either in an extreme cold or an extreme hot time of the year. But obviously having resources to have air conditioning, to have heat is going to be very important. And then community resilience factors, I think, are going to be a big determinant of the human impact of these climatic changes. So it's just to say it is a physical environment, but it's something that we cannot understand without health and place researchers who also focus on social factors. And we've come back to the EXPA zone. So it turned out that we spent like several decades and I don't know, billions of dollars trying to map the human genome, and we thought it was going to give us every insight we needed into health outcomes. And then it turned out that genetics accounted for like maybe 20% of the variance in health. All of those people, including many people at NIH, now believe that the way we're going to understand variance in human health outcomes is through the influence of the environment and exposures over the life course. They have come to you at this point. So what I think is important for this next evolution in health and place research is, again, that this research is done by the people who understand how health is impacted by place. But I do think it's really important area of research. I think understanding the links between environment and biology are important. And I think it's a new direction that a lot of our kind of fellow travelers will be going. But I would say, and I actually do say to anyone who will listen, particularly at NIH, that really it's health and place researchers who are needed to provide guidance and direction. I don't think that people who have traditionally not studied place can just suddenly pick up data sets and variables. But in fact, we're needed both for the conceptualization and the empirical work that we're going to be doing. I mean, this is happening, whether you know about it or agree with it. I do think this is the next 10 years at least in health and place research. Okay, I just want to make one final point, which is that most recently in my own work, I've been struggling with how to think about race and its relationship with place. So I've gone back to this figure that Gil and Devon did, because you can see at the top, they have race ethnicity, and they point out that race ethnicity determines your residential locations. So I recently had a PhD student defend a dissertation looking at the relationship between environmental, air-based lead concentrations and cognitive functioning. And she found that people who lived in census tracts with higher lead levels had lower scores on cognitive functioning. But once she controlled or included race ethnicity in the model, there was no relationship any longer. But I couldn't figure out how to interpret that, because I know that race determines where people live and that it has historically determined where pollution sites have been located and also whether they're being cleaned up as they're government mandated to. And so I think that we're going to have to engage more with people who think deeply about race and who think deeply about the historical importance of race and place to really understand things that we can't just be putting race as a control in our models. And even stratifying by race is not necessarily going to tell us about how much race has, as a function of systemic historical inequality and structural racism, determine the environments that people are exposed to. So again, I don't have answers here, but when I talk about these multidisciplinary teams, I do think that because we have to focus on health disparities to improve population health, we have to have teams that include people that are thinking about these issues as well. So just to summarize, I read once that TED Talks are really successful and popular and palatable because they have 3 points, but I'm an academic, so I can't have 3 points, but I separated it into 2 sections. So I would just say in summary, I think we made a tremendous amount of progress, but we still have a really long ways to go. So place matters. Now, everyone believes that. It's not the case when I started grad school. But I think the key for us is now going to be theorizing the total environment so we can really understand how and why place matters. I think we need more focus on how the impact of place varies over time in the life course. We've been really hindered in answering this question by lack of data, but there's really no excuse anymore with all the new data we have access to. And then to always keep in mind that the exposure to adverse environments is really unequal across the US population. So moving into more kind of practical implications about the role of health and place researchers. Sophisticated data and sophisticated methods without solid theoretical and conceptual underpinnings is just not going to get us very far. And so I think, again, that's where our contribution can be made in some of the work that we're going to be doing. As I've said repeatedly in this talk, multidisciplinary teams are, in my opinion, essential. We can all learn from each other. And then finally, we should be thinking about our research as really being helpful in informing policies and programs and interventions to improve health in communities and also at the national level. And finally, it takes a real community to do anything in the research world these days. I've been very fortunate to have a tremendous amount of support from the National Institute on Aging, and I have been extraordinarily lucky to have a wonderful team of current and former graduate students and postdocs that help me do all of this work.